And everybody did it because that's how the system works. If you don't have to pay higher wages, you'd be an idiot to do it. You'd go out of business. They knew that. So once the situation changed, once they didn't have to, they stopped. That set in motion everything else, and we're living with the consequences. The consequences of a system that works this way. If we had a different system, it would say, if the workers' productivity is going up, that's the basis for their claim to be given higher wages. End of story. That's a different system. That is a system that organizes a relationship between the production of workers and the pay they get. Doesn't make it subject to market forces because it doesn't want that to happen because of the consequences. Aristotle and Plato wrote about markets 5,000 years ago, right? We're supposed to believe that Aristotle and Plato are somehow the fountains of Western cultures. Pick up Aristotle and Plato and read. They wrote about markets because they had those things there. Plato hated them, Aristotle didn't think much of them, but felt that it was too socially disruptive by that time in Athens to get rid of them. So the compromise was control them. So you get the benefits, and there are some, without all the costs, and there are plenty of those. So the founders of our culture were not enamored of markets. They didn't think markets were the solution, that markets produced efficiency. They made fun of those arguments. That's a later development that requires us to pray to the market as an institution. The people we think we come from intellectually never did this. Yeah?
If the working class credit cards are maxed out, and if the prices are going down, if you got high unemployment, and then the Fed gives the money to the banks to lend, and the banks have no one to lend it to, are we in a liquidity trap?
Yeah.
And if they know it, Michael Hudson on Democracy Now! Last week said one of the purposes of QE2 was to provide money to actually go buy up assets in other countries, and that's one of the fears. Do you believe that's
No, Mr. Hudson is often given to dramatic projections. No, I think the liquidity trap, by the way, a very simple idea, basically invented by John Keynes in the 1930s, because he already noticed then that there are circumstances in which, when the monetary authority produces money and throws it into the banking system can't find anybody to lend it to. That the depression of the business community is so enormous that they're not going to borrow no matter how much money there is, no matter how low the interest rates. It's just too risky. There's just such a bad scene out there that they're not going to get caught doing it. At that point, you get what's called a liquidity trap, in the sense you keep pumping more and more money in, but it doesn't have any end result. It just sits in the bank because the banks can't find anyone to lend it to, and that's considered, a trap that you've fallen into and you can't kind of get out of it. If some of this money then leaves the United States and goes out to buy assets in other parts of the world, that doesn't change the liquidity trap, because that means nothing changes here. And it would be a wrinkle on that kind of thing. But whether or not that's going to happen, I'm not so clear. I think that in the United States, there is now a perception that is shaking the business community, and it has for about 1.5 years. And that is, or 2 years. Americans are not used to seeing an economic crisis born, developed, and worse here than anywhere else. If you remember the earlier crisis, the Asian crisis in 1997, the crisis in Russia when the ruble collapsed, the crisis in Mexico 10 or 15 years ago. We've had a series of crises that are known for the countries over there where they began. This crisis is ours. It explodes here, it develops here, it was produced here, and it's the worst here. I mean, not as bad as Mexico, but worst of the developed part of the world. And that is shaking Americans. And Americans are very frightened and upset. They don't know how to handle this. And that includes people in the highest rungs of the investment community. And I think for many of them, they have become believers in something called decoupling. That is, that they used to believe that the United States, what happened here is what would happen everywhere else. And they're now beginning to see that it doesn't necessarily have to go that way. And there's a rush to invest in the less developed world, the up-and-coming world, the new places like China and India very exciting because they don't seem to be in the hole that we're in. And so they have become, but you know, we've had that many times in the history of capitalism, an infatuation with Argentina, or an infatuation with Africa, or an infatuation with China. That's happened also several times. So I'm a little dubious about it, but at least for the time being, there's a movement of investing into the third world, into the less developed countries, because they seem to have found a way by producing and selling to China and so on to escape this crisis. And so there's an attraction for them. But I don't think it's a conspiracy so much. I don't think that American companies are going to do more in the way of producing in those places. The big places for Americans to go to have already been defined. They're China, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they're China and India. And the growth is there. China for producing, and India for more skilled white-collar work, because of the language and so forth. The Indians are going to be the place where outsourcing is done. And you can see that Obama, all due respect, who is in India, or was in India for the last few days, is really going out of his way to smooth and improve that, because American corporations in huge numbers have plans, have already done it, but they have huge plans, much larger than what's happened already, to outsource middle-level technical work to India. There are I don't mean to frighten you. There are millions of Americans going to college, learning skills for which there will be no jobs. They cannot compete. The Indians, you know, insurance companies in the United States are beginning to organize that. I think I told you this story. If you get sick, you need an operation. The insurance company will come to you and say, we covered your operation. We will pay for it. Here's your ticket. You're going to say, what? Here's your ticket. Your leg will be redone in New Delhi. We're going to cover the operation there. We're going to fly you from New York to New Delhi. We're going to put you up in a first-class hotel. You will be operated by a surgeon who was trained at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. You'll have a recovery for 3 days and we'll fly you home. And the reason the insurance company will do that is that the overall cost of having you operated that way is 1/4 of what it would be in a hospital 2 miles from your home. That's the way it is. And that we are at the beginning of that process. And that's going to produce a downward pressure on American wages and American salaries. And there's a sense, I get it mostly when I meet with businessmen and women, which I do from time to time here in New York. I get a sense, which I've never had before in my life, that the growth, you know, they're all focused on growth. Where's the market going to grow? It's almost everywhere but here. There's a sense of it's over here. It's just, now that may pass, but for the time being, this crisis has had as many crises have had in the past. You know, most cultural historians of the United States will tell you that we're still living out the legacy of the Great Depression. One of the reasons Americans went into the consumer frenzy after World War II was because of the shock of having those 10 years of depression followed by 6 years of World War II, when you couldn't buy stuff and you couldn't fix your house and when finally you could, all this accumulated sense of being deprived needed an outlet. And so these crises have a way, particularly when they last like this one does, of leaving long-lasting psychological scars and legacies. And there's something going on in the United States in which the upward and onward optimism that characterized this country for so long is being fundamentally questioned. It's kind of the anxiety that it's over. I get it, you know, I'm a professor. I spend an awful lot of my time with young people aged 17, 18, into their 20s. The level of pessimism about their job prospects and their whole life situation that I get now is really different from what I've had in the past.